There you go, girl.
Okay, we are recording.
Whenever you are both ready.
Okay, Jamie, how are you feeling? You good to go?
To go.
Awesome. Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Alana, and I'm going to be your room host. You are in the yellow room, and our speaker is Jamie Sabbach. She is the president of the 110% Incorporation, and the session you are attending is the dollars and cents of Parks and Recreation.
I think the floor is mine. So good morning, everyone. Very much appreciate your time and attention this morning. I certainly also appreciate the invitation to be a part of your conference. It was really great to see such a large group during the keynote this morning. So again, thank you for the invitation. I am Jamie Sabbach. I'm the president and CEO of 110% Incorporated. I'll give you a very brief backstory on myself to kind of set the stage for the content of this morning's presentation, but I'm a 30+ year park and recreation servant. I spent 20 years as a practicing park and recreation professional. My last position as a practitioner was with the city of Boulder, Colorado, as a superintendent for the park and recreation system there. In the last 10 years, I've been in higher education and consulting across the US as well as Canada. And what I bring to you today is likely to be, from some people's perspectives, rather provocative information. And it's about the dollars and cents of our profession and where we're headed essentially and how we can think differently in terms of the legacy of our profession. The content I'm going to share with you is built upon not only my experience as a practitioner, but my years as a student of the profession as a teacher, as well as 10 years working with agencies in 40 of the 50 US states. And really these are built upon observations of what works well, what hasn't worked well, and frankly, a lot of research and information concerning the new stage from which we're going to work and how we can all think differently. So we're going to have a bit of a roller coaster ride. I'm going to be a significant amount of content with you in a very short period of time. This is really actually 2 full days of content scaled down to make it more of a small bite for all of you. But I ask you to hold on tight. Hopefully it's engaging enough content that will keep you excited and motivated throughout. So I'm going to start with something that is incredibly controversial in our profession, and that's this notion of essential. If you were part of the keynote, you heard some storyline around how essential our profession is. And while I believe that some of what we provide is essential, I'm not convinced that our entire profession or all of the services that we provide our communities are indeed essential. And I think we really have to continue to process the question, what is it about Parks and Recreation that either makes it essential or does not? And if all of what we provide is not essential, then which services are truly the must-haves in our communities? And I think in terms of how we're going to choose to invest and spend taxpayer dollars and how we're going to think about revenue generating opportunities, and again, creating a platform from which we can be fiscally healthy, we need to understand what essential park and recreation services are. Those services that require subsidy dollars, they require a taxpayer investment. And if we think about it through the lens of a definition that works for our profession, we may simply suggest that these are the services that are absolutely necessary to community quality of life. There's those that are critical to preserving life, health, and the basic social function in our communities. And while particularly today, I think we would all agree that things like our parks and our open spaces and our trails really have become truly an essential service that now more of America understands. There are things we provide that questionably may not fall into that bucket of a must-have. Maybe it's a yoga class that someone can get at a local yoga studio, and maybe it's some other kind of service. But I think we have to continue to grapple with what is it about our profession that can be viewed as essential. While this is an incredibly important narrative that we've got to begin to address and face in this moment in time, there are many reasons why we've got to spend some time on the evaluation and analysis of what are essential services as part of our service menus. I'm going to take you back to a real quick research study that again helps set the stage around the importance of fiscal responsibility and financial discipline in our profession today. If we go back just a few years ago, and some of you may remember reading an article in Parks and Recreation magazine, the primary and principal resource of the National Recreation and Park Association, Dr. Andy Mowen of Penn State University and a team of graduate students took the time to really assess whether or not Parks and Recreation is seen as essential in its communities. And they actually interviewed over 800 policymakers at the local level and county levels in terms of what their belief was around how valuable is Parks and Recreation. And at the end of the day, if there are budget reductions, where does Parks and Recreation live in the food chain? Again, this was 2017. And you can see a snapshot of the results here. 95% of the people that they interviewed said they personally used their local park areas. 99% agreed that communities benefited from local parks. And while these officials agreed that Parks and Recreation is a principal solution to some of the critical issues facing communities today, if we go back to the benefits or endless movement, we remember things like, how we impact the quality of life of communities and how we prevent youth crime and so on. There was an acknowledgement of that. But these same people were less likely to view Parks and Recreation as a contribution to their number one concern, which was the economy, right? It was attracting and retaining businesses. And we have fought tooth and nail for decades to suggest we are an economic engine. But the reality is that many in positions of power and control and those who influence policy don't necessarily see Parks and Recreation through that lens. So while 6 and 7 of these folks agreed that Parks and Recreation was well worth the tax dollars spent on it, they indicated that Parks and Recreation was likely to be hit with the largest funding cut when the city, town, or county suffered budgetary pressure. Again, this was 2017. Now let's fast forward to today, right? Just this year, NRPA has been doing a series, obviously, of surveys and analyses of professionals in our country and agencies across the country to determine what's happening relative to our bottom line. And the last bit of data was in the last part of June, was through NRPA Parks Snapshot. And you can see some of the interesting and revealing data on the screen. 66%, or 2 in 3 agencies, are facing operational budget reductions right now, with the median reduction being between 10 and 19%. And nearly 1 in 5 are reducing operations spending by at least 30%. 57% of these agencies are facing capital budget reductions, with the median reduction between 50 and 59%. And 1 in 5 report that their capital budget has been zeroed out. So we've got to understand on the front line that this is our fiscal reality, and this is the new playing field from which we are going to exist. So we may begin to start asking this question, or actually posing this statement to ourselves. We've got to stop asking for more of what does not exist. If the money is not there, it's not going to just appear. Rather, we've got to begin to think about how do we do better with what it is we have. And that provides us with a platform from which we can work. The other thing I want to share with you on the front end of this, to kind of continue to set the stage around this critical work, working towards becoming agencies that have more financial discipline, is a very sad case study. And it's one that's being studied a lot and talked about a lot in our profession today. We go back just 2 or 3 decades, the City of Portland Park and Recreation Bureau was one that was considered an agency to be emulated in our country. It was a role model organization. Portland was building a significant amount of infrastructure. Many people were moving in. And what we see today over the last decade is their expenditures have far outpaced their revenues, to the point that this organization is in crisis. And if you've been following any news feeds, you recognize the social unrest that continues in this city. So we understand that now this organization really has an uncertain future. They don't know what they're going to look like when they come out the other end, as they say. Now, we would all agree that if we looked at this and this was reflective of our personal budget, our personal reality, we know we would be leaning towards bankruptcy, or we would already be there. So this is the critical importance of us understanding that this challenge around fiscal discipline and financial discipline in our profession is critical in this moment in time, more than it's ever been. And even the likes of the Portlands of the world, the ones that were doing really well, had a lot of cash in the bank, were building at an incredible clip, were providing what everybody wanted them to provide, have now found themselves in a state of chaos and crisis as it relates to their bottom line. This can happen to anyone at any time unless they exhibit financial discipline. So we have an opportunity to flip the script, as I like to say. While sometimes this narrative feels a bit doom and gloom, we have a chance to tell a story and write a story around the legacy of our profession. And rather than constantly reacting and waiting for someone to tell us what's going to happen, we're positioned now to actually write the story and be in a place and space where we can control our own destiny. So it's an opportunistic time, but we're going to have to change how we're doing things as a profession as a whole. And this messaging for some of you may simply be an affirmation. It may be in similar context to what it is you're currently doing. For others, it may be an absolutely different way of thinking. But I want to take a very complex topic and put it into 3 buckets for us today for the purposes of our conversation, the content I'm delivering to you, of course, and sharing this kind of information within a very short period of time. But I'm going to put today's session into bucket 1 being paying attention to what's going on around us so that we can understand how we can move forward intelligently and responsibly. Second, really focusing on impact. And third, of course, thinking about how we can best optimize our resources. So let's start with paying attention. There are a number of things happening in this moment in time, some of which I've already addressed. But I think we would all recognize today, more than ever, we are in the midst of some incredible economic uncertainty. We have no idea what this is all going to look like when the dust settles. And we've got major economists today telling us, well, 2020 was difficult, 2021 and likely 2022 are going to be more difficult. So we've got to come to terms with that and understand that and embrace that notion and allow us to say, okay, let's take a deep breath, let's hit pause and think about how we're going to respond. Second, we know we're seeing increasing disparities in our communities. We had challenges with the haves and have-nots and the huge gap we had previous to the pandemic. And we now know inequities have increased. And they've increased to the place and a point where we've got some real challenges ahead in terms of how do we choose to invest in equity issues in our community in contrast to continuing to do what we've always done. We've got a general lack of revenue diversification in our profession. Many would acknowledge that, you know, if we go to a personal banker or a finance person, they'll tell us, you know what, you really need to diversify your portfolio in the event you had a portfolio. While in the park and recreation profession, we still are heavily dependent on an incredibly volatile source, and that's taxpayer dollars. We've got limited financial literacy, some would argue business acumen in our profession. We're a social service profession, and while that's incredibly noble, we don't necessarily put as much energy and resource towards understanding the business side of things, right? Management and operational strategy, financial literacy, and the importance of financial literacy, particularly again in this moment in time. One of the principal challenges government faces today, and it was interesting watching 60 Minutes last night and listening to Barack Obama speak about uninformed citizenry. This has been for years been one of the banes of government's existence, and that's that we have many community members who are uninformed about how government works. They're uninformed in terms of where their taxpayer dollars are spent. And many of us, I assume responsibility as well, have not done a good enough job letting our communities know, here's how your taxpayer dollars are spent. And while you do pay taxes, it doesn't entitle you to all free government services. We also have unreasonable expectations on behalf of our communities, some of which have been compounded because of the pandemic. Folks are going to expect more of us, and we're going to have to be prepared to respond to those expectations. We know today in the United States, our infrastructure crisis is beyond, in some cases, repair. We've got trillions of dollars necessary for water infrastructure. We've got roads and bridges collapsing, underfoot. And in the park and recreation profession, we too have an infrastructure crisis. We like to build, we don't necessarily put as much energy and resource towards maintaining. And we also, I think, acknowledge today that many of our competitors, whether they're other public sector organizations, the nonprofit, or even the private sector, are struggling to stay afloat in this moment in time. And understanding what that means to us and understanding that we may have a responsibility to help them succeed, particularly the private sector, because if the private sector goes under, it dilutes the very tax resources upon which we've become dependent. So this is a list of reality. Again, it may appear doom and gloom, but it's an opportunity for us to understand where are we today? What's the playing field that we're working from in order to intelligently move forward? So the future does rely on the choices that we make in this moment in time. And as a profession, we've had some folks in higher education and the academic world suggest we have a bit of a lemming syndrome. You know, things like NRPA Connect, while are really supposed to be good things, oftentimes are used as crutches. You know, we tend to copy paste, tend to rinse and repeat. And we've got to think differently about how we're going to make choices that are in the best interest of our communities based upon our demographic profiles and the economic realities that we face in our communities. So what are some things we can think about in terms of the dollars and cents of it all? How do we best use the resources we have available? And how can we make impacts that are going to be profound and really have an effect on our communities for the long haul? Well, what you see on the screen here are two things that we as citizens, we as taxpayers expect of our governments. We expect our government to take care of common resources, whether that might be the environment, our infrastructure, right, our roads, our bridges, our water. And we also expect government to impact social issues and address conflicts, things like the health and wellness of our communities and our society and social equity issues. Let's take a close look at these for a moment and align these with NRPA's pillars. So for those of you that do know, and I'm sure it's most of you on the line, the National Recreation and Parks Association has identified 3 pillars of our profession. One is health and wellness. Again, think about it in terms of impacting social issues, right? An expectation of its the citizenry of its governments. We're expected as a profession to lead the nation in improving health and wellness through parks and recreation. We're also expected to align with the pillar of equity, right? Equity in our communities, addressing inequities in our communities so that people have access to services. And finally, conservation, AKA also our infrastructure. How do we think about protecting open space and taking care of our open spaces, our lands, and the infrastructure we provide to our communities? So I think it's important, again, as we talk about the dollars and cents of the profession, and again, that's not CENTS, that we ask ourselves, how are we doing relative to these pillars? How are we doing in terms of response to the things that our citizenry expect of us or need us to do? So let's start by looking at one health and wellness issue in a concentrated way, right? Let's do a really abbreviated deep dive into the obesity crisis in the United States. And by the way, it's no longer called a crisis, it's being called a pandemic by the American College of Physicians. So look at the top left there. In 1986, this was one of the first maps that came out of the Centers for Disease Control. And what it suggested to us was, you know what, we were starting to question what was happening in our states across the US in terms of obesity. At this point in time, the jury was out, right? You see a lot of states here, there was no data available. And full disclosure, this is when I started in the profession. So CDC comes out and says, obesity is something we should probably keep an eye on. Let's fast forward to 1994, the next map that resulted in the top right, you see more data starts to emerge. And we look and we say, there's a disturbing trend at play here. We need to start doing something. Bottom left, fast forward another 8 years to 2002, you see the data continuing to move in the direction that is not positive. It's not the direction we want to see it moving in. Bottom right, 2009 again. Now we're getting to the point where we're starting to talk about some states in the US being at 30% of their population being classified as clinically obese. Now let's fast forward a decade to today. This map just came out in the spring, and what it tells us is we're now starting to talk in terms of 60% of some states' total population being clinically obese in the United States. And finally, if we look at 2030, we see the projections are that 8 states could be at 60% of their populace being clinically obese by the year 2030. Now, the question for everybody in our profession, myself included, is how are we doing? If we have hung our hats on being a leader in the health and wellness of our communities, how are we doing? And we would all acknowledge we're not the only ones in the game, right? There's fast food, there's personal responsibility, there's access to good food, there's obviously poverty, there's food deserts in our country, there's school vending machines, and the list goes on and on. But if we are going to be asking ourselves whether or not we are investing our taxpayer resources in order to make the greatest impact on our communities, we have got to ask ourselves through the lens of one health indicator, how are we doing? Let's look at another NRPA pillar, and let's look at infrastructure and conservation. I'm going to shift gears here for a moment. Again, and this is all about how are we spending taxpayer dollars in this moment in time. Now, this illustration on the screen represents an article that came out in Outdoor Magazine online in the summer of 2018. And the suggestion here was quite clear. It was that the National Park Service needed $11.6 billion to take care of its existing infrastructure. Now, full disclosure, back in 2012, a similar data point came out. It was an article that was put out through the Epley Institute at Indiana University and the Parks and Recreation Department that said that the National Park Service in 2012 needed $12 billion to take care of its infrastructure. Now, we all know that the federal government has not invested that much in the National Park Service over the last 9 years, which means if it was $12 billion in 2012, it's likely not $12 billion today. And there are also some estimates that suggested that it's not $12 billion, it's actually $80 billion. And if that's the case, and we continue not to invest, that means by the year 2026, we're going to have $160 billion in maintenance needs at the National Park Service level. Now we have to fundamentally ask ourselves, how did we get here? What choices were made? What decisions were made or maybe weren't made that got us to the place where we have such an infrastructure crisis in our national parks? But most of you on the line aren't associated with federal parks and recreation systems. Most are at the local level. So let's take a look just at a couple of examples of local park and recreation systems in the United States. And a couple of these that I'm calling out are very prolific systems. The first is the City of Austin Park and Recreation Department. And I had the pleasure of working with the former director. She was my mentor. She was my boss in Champaign, Illinois many years ago. And I felt the pain and agony of what was happening in Austin through her eyes. But they have, just as of last year, said that they needed $1.3 billion to take care of their maintenance backlog. Austin has over 35 outdoor pools, 50 aquatics facilities, if you will, and the average age of their aquatics facilities is 50 years. What didn't happen? What choices were made or what decisions weren't made that got them to this place in time? In addition, if we look at the state parks of Pennsylvania, just again in December of 2019, State Parks of Pennsylvania came out and said they needed $1 billion in maintenance backlog. And State Parks of Pennsylvania just a couple of years ago were awarded a national gold medal through the National Sporting Goods Association and the National Recreation and Park Association. And finally, we can look at another example, the City of New York, right? Central Park, this iconic system in the United States that came out in June of 2018 and said, we need $6 billion to take care of our infrastructure crisis. You know, we've got this large of a backlog. So again, the question for all of us is, how are we doing relative to conservation and infrastructure management and investment choices and health and wellness in our society? So it really puts the onus on us to say, what decisions do we need to make moving forward to address these things? How can we have an impact? Where do we need to put our investments, right? Where do we need to be spending taxpayer resources in order to have the greatest impact on society, and in particular in our communities? And I also want to call out on the coattails of this conversation about infrastructure. And this is something I spent an inordinate amount of time working on, and it's a passion of mine in our field, and it has been for many years. Well, a lot of people were lauding the Great Outdoors Act. You know, every time you looked at a LinkedIn post, it was how wonderful this was. And I don't want to diminish the value of getting resources to invest in our infrastructure. We have got to recognize and acknowledge that what we have been gifted, if you will, at the federal level is absolutely insufficient to take care of our systems across the US. This cannot be a fallback. We've got to do due diligence in terms of how we're going to make choices to invest in our own infrastructure. The great insufficiency of the Great Outdoors Act must be called out because, number one, it was intended to fully and permanently fund the Land and Water Conservation Fund at $900 million a year. Think about all of the systems in the United States that go after LWCF money. $900 million a year is not a lot of money. And in addition, if we just look back 2-3 minutes ago to the National Park Service debt in terms of its infrastructure crisis, the Great Outdoors Act was intended to provide $9.5 billion over 5 years, or $1.9 billion annually. That would barely cover the City of Austin's infrastructure crisis. So we've got to understand we can no longer just depend on the floodgates to open in terms of funding. We've got to think differently about how we can make choices and the decisions that will be necessary to ensure investment in our own systems. So that said, right, setting the stage, our realities as a profession, what are the things that we have an ability and possibly a demand to impact in our communities, right? It's a moral imperative. It really comes down to how we choose to manage our dollars and cents, right? We have branded this notion of the dollars and cents of parks and recreation in this way. We're calling it parks and reconomics. And it's how park and recreation systems across the United States are now going to choose to manage their finite fiscal resources. For decades, particularly, I can think back to my 20 years as a practitioner and even the 5 years I spent with the City of Boulder, we kept referring to our limited financial resources. And today we've changed the word limited to finite. There's only so much to go around, and the question for all of us will be, how will we choose to spend it? What choices will we make in terms of investment? The good news here, the thing that requires celebration and applause, is that we're starting to see a movement towards financial discipline. Many of you are probably recognizing that in this moment in time, we are going to have some unpopular discussions around what stays and what goes. Where do we invest and where do we not? Because again, we've only got so much to invest. So we want to be thinking about where can we have the greatest impact on our communities as a whole. The other thing I want to share with you very briefly is, our lane is cost recovery. Our lane is this work towards financial discipline. And often I hear so many professionals say, I'm tired of hearing about cost recovery. This is not what our profession is all about. We work too hard. We shouldn't be focused on the bottom line. And I urge and I plead my colleagues and my peers in this profession to think about this differently. And it's simply that what we're trying to do is balance our social service hearts with our business intelligence, right? Our management intellect. Because at the end of the day, if we don't have money in the bank and we can't write the checks, nothing else matters. So we've got to be able to support and subsidize the critical services that our communities must have in this moment in time. So we're going to look at cost recovery a little differently, right? Because it's not just cost recovery, it's about how do we invest taxpayer dollars in the most responsible, effective way? How do we have the impacts on our communities we'd like to have? So we're going to look real briefly at this notion of cost recovery, right? It's, it's kind of the four-letter word in our profession. It's become the four-letter word in our profession. But how we've thought about cost recovery in the past, while the intention was noble and good, was really ineffective. We would actually have this series of arbitrary benchmarks. And what you see on the screen actually came out in the early 90s. I was the director of recreation and community services for the city of Bloomington, Indiana. NRPA started talking about cost recovery a lot more. And in that moment in time, in the late 80s, early 90s, we didn't need to worry about cost recovery, right? Government was pretty fat. We were doing well. We were building like crazy. We were adding to our service portfolio. Everything was great. But there were some saying, those particularly who kind of leaned towards business acumen, was, wait a minute, we've really got to be smart about how we spend money, right? This is not a panacea that we're always going to have more money than we know what to do with. So we started to talk about cost recovery, and these were the benchmarks that revealed themselves to the profession. And while it was a place to begin, we found over time it was ineffective because these were arbitrary. As well, we were starting to suggest that cost recovery needs to be set based upon interest areas, right? Social values areas like sport or aquatics or seniors and so on. And it became hugely problematic for us, and it's become problematic for us over the years. And today we look at it through a different lens. We look at it through a slightly different lens that allows us to create a tax investment revenue enhancement philosophy, AKA cost recovery strategy, right? Really speaking to how are we going to spend taxpayer dollars and how do we think about revenue generation? Where are our opportunities to generate revenues that will allow us to reinvest in our system, maybe reinvest in our infrastructure, maybe affect low-income families in our communities and address social equity issues in our communities or inequities in our communities. But this methodology has been one studied by Penn State University, and we're finding to be incredibly effective. On the left, you see service categories. The middle leg of the stool is beneficiary of service, and the right is cost of service. And these three pillars allow our profession, our organizations to establish philosophies around how they're going to spend taxpayer resources and how they're going to think about revenue enhancement in a very intelligent, defensible, and justifiable way. So let's look at these one at a time as we go through this process of thinking about how can we balance the books? How can we be smart about investing taxpayer resources? How can we be intelligent and creative in revenue enhancement? So let's start with the first leg. Now, in our conventional, traditional park and recreation systems today, we all know we have function areas, right? We have service areas. We have sports, we have aquatics, we have seniors, we have events, and so on. The story goes in parks. And while functionally and operationally, those divisions make all the sense in the world, right? They're like types of services. When it comes to cost recovery expectation, it's become hugely problematic for us because we've set arbitrary goals based upon social values. We might suggest in our organization, because the mayor happens to be the president of the local Little League, that sports is something that's going to be untouched. And we're not going to talk about raising fees there because it'll be a political nightmare. And while kids are, they're the future and all of these other kind of grandiose ideas and concepts, we have done ourselves a disservice in terms of how we can intelligently set cost recovery goals. Alternatively, on the right, you see a little girl who's in a dance program and you say, well, not everybody participates in the arts, and well, it tends to be a little bit more of a pretentious area, and people should charge, or people should pay more in that area, so we're going to expect higher cost recovery expectation. So we've been very arbitrary. the end of the day, we want to think about categorization of our services differently to help ourselves in terms of thinking about our cost recovery strategy, right? In terms of the bottom line, in terms of how to invest equitably and responsibly in our communities. So service categories give us a different lens through which to look. So let me give you an example. And Henry's picture's on the screen here, so I'm going to call on him, and I'm glad you looked up, Henry. So let's say Henry for a moment's got the little guy on the left. Okay, that's his son, and he's going to play t-ball. It's the first time he's picked up a ball and bat. He's really excited. They got these cool uniforms in the organization. That's fantastic. And our conventional division department, right, it's a youth sport, but it's an introductory level activity. And let's say Alana's little girl's on the right of the screen, and she's going to take an intro to ballet class for the very first time in her life. And let's say, hypothetically, Jamie's mom is 75 years old, and Jamie's mom has always wanted to play the guitar. And while Jamie's mom's a senior, she's going to take a guitar lesson, and it's intro to guitar class. In our conventional way of thinking, we would say youth sports, we would say dance, and we would say seniors, right? And then we would pluck numbers out of the air to determine what our goals are going to be for sports, dance, and seniors. Alternatively, if we look at those three services through the lens of service categories, what we may find is each of those services, while they serve a different population or a different age group or a different interest area, they're all introductory level activities. So it allows us to categorize our services differently, minimizing social values debates. Again, if we go into the mayor, who's the president of local Little League, and we say we have introductory level activities in this category, he might be looking for youth sports. He's not going to necessarily call it out. So it diminishes social values debates and positioning in our profession. The next leg of the stool is connecting the dots between these categories that represent our service menus and who benefits. Again, if we think about how we thought historically relative to cost recovery, the two services on the screen represent aquatics programs. However, the one on the left is a learn to swim program, and the one on the right might be our master swim team. And the one on the left, we might suggest, while it's a learn to swim program, it's more accessible to a majority of our community. In contrast to the service on the right, representing a master swim team or a competitive swim team, requires a particular mastery of skill, high-level skill in order to participate. We might suggest that it's more discretionary, it's more specialized, it's more individualized. And what we begin to ask ourselves is, who's benefiting from these services, the community as a whole or the individual? And ultimately, what that allows us to do is make informed decisions about how we should be spending taxpayer dollars. Obviously, we're going to direct more of our taxpayer resources towards services that are accessible to a greater portion of the community and benefit the community as a whole or the common good. In contrast, we may look at the services that are more individualized and specialized, possibly not investing any taxpayer dollars in those, expecting possibly a return on investment from those services. And what we begin to see is our philosophy unfold in an image form, right? Think about the categories you would provide for your organization, plotting them on a continuum from those in the bottom left being the services you believe provide for a greater common good. Those that are your essential services. There's a greater community-wide interest. They have far-reaching impacts. There's a universal value, and they're accessible to all. To the categories in the top right of the continuum being those that are more discretionary, there's more of a self-interest service, limited impact, they're more exclusive in nature, and there's access for some. But it allows us to begin to think about now, how are we going to invest our taxpayer resources to have the greatest impact on the community as a whole and exhibit some level of financial discipline? So we're not arbitrarily setting fees, and we're not making choices simply because of special interest. But we know at the end of the day, in order to be able to have a strategy that works and a philosophy that can be supported and acknowledged and justified, we've got to understand our cost of service. And this is kind of the big, hairy, audacious part of the exercise. So I liken it to a teenage driver. The public sector for many years, and I'm going to say our profession for many years, has been quite ill-equipped in terms of accounting for costs. We tend to just look at direct costs only, and we haven't accounted for all costs. Executive directors aren't free, right? Nor are their benefits. Facilities aren't free, nor are the utilities that support them. So the profession today has leaned towards now beginning to think about indirect costs as part of the equation. We think about teenage drivers in the public sector. Teenage drivers believe, most cases, that the only costs associated with operating a motor vehicle are gasoline. They forget about plating the car and buying insurance and the fact that ultimately they're going to have to replace the car. So again, we've got to think differently here, and we've got to now start articulating cost recovery in terms of all costs and not just direct costs moving forward. And once we're able to do that as organizations, we can now create our strategy, which can be illustrated in model form, right? This is how we're going to spend taxpayer dollars. This is how we're going to think about revenue enhancement. We create our categories, we plot them on a continuum from those in the bottom left providing the greatest community benefit to those in the top right providing the greatest individualized benefit. We identify what our current cost of service is, which allows us to make informed decisions about what our goals can be moving forward. Cost recovery goals cannot be arbitrary or it becomes an ineffective exercise. I liken it to, I say this all the time in presentations, I may have aspirations to run a marathon, but if I can't hold my happy hind end around the block, I may want to start with a 5K, right? We've got to understand what we're capable of doing in this moment in order to establish goals that are realistic for us moving forward. So I'm going to share a very recent model with you that was just created by the City of Wheat Ridge. This was their draft as of the end of September. Going through the methodology that was shared, they created their service categories to represent all 7,500 services, activities, classes, courses, events that they provide. They created definitions for these categories as well as examples. They went through the beneficiary of service exercise with themselves, their board, and their council to plot the categories on the continuum. From the bottom left, those categories that provide for the greatest community benefit to those in the top right providing for the greatest individual benefit. Ultimately, completing a cost of service analysis, determining what their current cost recovery performance levels were, allowing them to make informed decisions about what they believe over the next 12 to 18 months they can do in terms of cost recovery performance. And notice 3 categories from the top right of the continuum, their expectation is to generate excess revenues, which will allow them to reinvest in their own organization and getting them away from being completely reliant on taxpayer resources. This provides them a bit of an entrepreneurial opportunity, recognizing that not everyone in their community is disenfranchised. They are now taking responsibility for generating additional revenues and not relying solely on the general fund. A couple of things I want to share and some kind of final insights for you to consider as we continue to process this notion of financial discipline in our profession is we've got to get out of our own way. There are a few things that tend to continue to become problematic for many of us. There's a whole slew of information I can share with you about a theory called tragedy of the commons. If you're a park and recreation professional and you do not know what tragedy of the commons is, I strongly encourage you to get on Google, spend 5 minutes and get a better understanding of this theory. It has everything to do with the notion of financial discipline and how we use resources in our profession today. But this theory was created in 1968 by an environmentalist economist named Garrett Hardin, and it was built on the back of conservation. And essentially the messaging around this was the individual exploitation of finite resources invites overall ruin. Again, let me repeat that. The individual exploitation of common resource invites overall ruin. And while in 1968, the theory is built on the back of the environment, and essentially meaning if we have individual exploitation of a common resource, we invite overall ruin. Today, we're aligning this theory with how we use taxpayer dollars. How many of you are charging $25 for youth sport organizations to use fields that cost your organizations tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars? And it pains me to say that as a former college softball player. I'm passionate about youth sports. But the reality is we're allowing certain special interest groups to exploit the finite resources we have available. And then we say we don't have enough to do X, Y, and Z, which are the needs in our communities, to address the needs in our communities. We've got to take a step back and hit pause and ask, at what price? How much are we investing? And is there truly a return on investment for this community, or is it for small groups of individuals? What's the right price, right? So tragedy of the common, while an environmental theory, has now become an economic theory in many ways. Alternatively, there are a couple other things that become problematic for our profession in terms of thinking about responsible use of taxpayer dollars. One is the difference between our ability to pay populations and our willingness to pay populations. So we acknowledge today that over half of Wall Street is owned by 1% of the population. There are people in society who can pay. We also acknowledge that the population that has the most discretionary income than any other in the United States are those over the age of 62. Yet we're afraid to charge a going rate. We're afraid to touch market rate. We've got to recognize that there are people in most communities who have an ability to pay. They just may not want to. So this cannot become the bane of our existence, suggesting that everything needs to stay affordable us playing to the lowest common denominator because we're afraid people won't pay. And what we're doing is essentially compromising the bottom line. If we can charge market rate, it allows us to reinvest in our system so we can provide needs-based assistance to those who need help, rather than assuming everyone can only pay $1 or $2 or $5. Alternatively, and it links with the fact that we have uninformed constituencies in our society, we have this thing called the fairness effect, which is simply this: I pay taxes, therefore you owe me everything I want. And many of you are on the receiving end of that often. Somebody pays taxes and they think, well, they shouldn't have to pay for a service. Well, our taxpayer resources likely just cover the cost of providing parks. Recreation years ago was never part of the game of subsidy. Recreation was always expected to generate something to offset its costs. So this really challenges us to think differently about affordability. It makes us think differently about cost recovery. It makes us think differently about what the possibilities are and how we can help reinvest in our own organizations. So as I mentioned at the beginning, kind of comes full circle, we have an opportunity to create tomorrow's narrative. We have an opportunity to take control, if you will, and not assume that everyone's going to tell us what this is going to look like next, right? We can change the narrative. One of the things I think we're going to have to do is change from being a profession that's something for everyone all the time to a profession that focuses on the needs of our communities today. And maybe it's simply parks, open spaces, and childcare for the moment, right? What are the things that are most critical to our communities in this moment in time? And really getting away from subsidizing services that frankly have no business being subsidized. So shifting our purpose in this moment is going to be critical. And finally, I want to share an insight with you. I'll reserve the big backstory for another time for some of you that may ever want to hear it, but I had the chance to speak at a conference in Rimini, Italy back in 2012, and it was on this very content and topic, and this was in the midst of Greece going through austerity measures and everything else. And the narrative was quite simple. It was the public sector and the nonprofit sector, particularly in the Western world, are going to have to think differently about full cost recovery. Full cost recovery, first of all, again, is not a four-letter word. We're simply talking about recovering our costs. But if we can get more of our service menu into a place where we can recover full cost recovery, then we can put our subsidy dollars towards the things that are going to have the greatest impact on our community as a whole. Rather than subsidizing youth sports organizations that are paying tens of thousands of dollars to private and nonprofits to run them, having them pay a fair market rate so we can put tree canopy in the south side of town where many of our low-income families live, and the health indicators are the most devastating, right? It's what choices are we making about the subsidies that we have available to us. But at the end of the day, it's a way for us to think about taking care of the mothership. We are going to have services that are going to have to move into the full cost recovery expectation area if they're going to exist. We are likely going to become more dependent upon enterprise opportunities, things that can generate excess revenues for us. We know there's a critical part of our service menu that must have subsidy in order to survive. Unless we all plan on putting wrought iron gates around our parks and having gate attendants there collecting fees, our parks are going to likely, I won't say always, but likely for a long period of time, have to have subsidy in order to exist. And we likely would all recognize there are parts of our service menu that we should be letting go of. Other organizations provide these services, or frankly, maybe they're just not part of our mission. Why are we subsidizing them when we can gracefully exit and then reinvest those resources, whether it's money, time, or space, to other services that are needed in our community? It's simply a different way of thinking. So with that, I think we're close to time here. I wanted to make sure that there was sufficient time for Q&A at the conclusion. It's a lot of information to take in a very short period of time. Thought about putting some fun polls in and doing some other things. And I thought, no, we're going to rapid fire this stuff, get it out to you, and then see if anybody has any thoughts, comments, questions that they like to share in terms of the content that's been shared with all of you today. Alana, would you like me to just jump in with the chat?
Sure. I'm not seeing any questions come up so far. Just thank you and amazing information. But yeah, as they come up, you can go ahead and respond if there's any questions, if anyone has any at this time.
So we've got a question here. Our council believes, or a comment, I guess, our council believes that we cannot charge more than the actual cost of service to make a profit. How do we respond to that? One strategy that I have found to be incredibly effective is, well, actually there's one strategy, but there's a variety of approaches that you can take to implementing the strategy. Number one is if you know you have infrastructure needs and your capital is not sufficient, you can start to have the narrative, and the city of Austin has been doing this recently, as have others, start to use the narrative that if we can't get the sufficient dollars we need to maintain our infrastructure out of the general fund, by allowing us to generate additional revenues through services, we may be able to invest that money into our capital, right? Into investing in our existing infrastructure. Alternatively, if you know there are equity issues in your community, it may be a good way for you to challenge the council to think differently so that you can generate excess revenues to invest in equity interests. Maybe something as simple as, embellishing your need-based assistance program, right? Your scholarships, reduced rates. It may be that you want to honor the 10-minute walk campaign in your community. Whatever it may be, if they can see that there's some value and nobility in generating additional revenues on behalf of certain services in your service menu to invest in your system, it could be a great platform to have that dialogue and that conversation, particularly if it aligns with a council goal. There are a lot of councils today that have council goals around taking care of our existing infrastructure or social equity. So you may be able to leverage that to your organization and, more importantly, your community's advantage. Great, it's a great question. Can we get the PowerPoint? No, I'm kidding. I'm absolutely more than willing to share it with you. Do you do this all at once or estimated time it takes to turn philosophy around? It depends. If you're in an organization the size of a canoe, you can turn it around a little quicker than if your organization's like the Austin, Texas or Chicago Park District where you're navigating the Titanic. So it's going to take a little bit more time based upon how large your system is, right? The scale, the scope of your organization. And I'm happy to share the PowerPoint. If someone from CPRS would tell me where to send it, I'll do that. And then you can distribute it to those on this webinar, and I'll send it in PDF form. Next question is, can you please point to some organizations that you think are using really strong cost recovery models so we can see some examples in action and do our own follow-up research? Absolutely. There's quite a few that come to mind. I don't know the best way to get that information to you. But there's models across the country where you've got very bold, courageous executive directors taking the bull by the horns, having difficult conversations and unpopular conversations with councils and boards saying, look, here's our bottom line. Here's what the future looks like. Here's our infrastructure needs in this moment. Here are the needs in our community. And what we're doing right now is it's not getting it done. We've got insufficient funds. And we know there's no more general fund money. There's no more taxpayer dollars available to us. So here's the alternative. Here's the approach we're going to take to change that narrative. So Sandra, I'm not sure the best way to get that to you, but I'm happy to share some examples that I think are really good ones out there today. And I'll tell you right now off the cuff, Louisville, Texas Parks and Recreation is doing a phenomenal job. They're in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex. Stacy Anaya is their director. She is very active at the national level and at the state level. She has happily suggested she will talk with anybody to help them get the party started as it relates to this work. Thank you for your valuable insight. Thank you. Are you on social media? Yes, I'm on LinkedIn. You can just do a quick search, Jamie Sabbach, S-A-B-B-A-C-H. I'll put my information up here in a moment. Next question, how have you seen organizations incorporate equity into their cost recovery model? Again, I point you to Louisville, Texas, folks. If you're serious about this work, they are an absolute success story as it relates to case studies in cost recovery. They created four policies that resulted from their cost recovery effort. They call their cost recovery model a financial support and sustainability strategy, which illustrates how they're spending taxpayer dollars in contrast to cost recovery goals. So while we all know it means the same thing, it's flipping the model on its head. It resonates with their council. It resonates with their community. People can see how their tax dollars are being used. They also created a new capital investment policy that has called out the fact that they're placing a complete moratorium on new build right now. We're not building anything. We're putting all of our capital in our existing infrastructure. And then they also created a social equity policy, which is quite robust. It speaks to needs-based assistance, 10-minute walk campaigns, and so on. And they also created a parkland acquisition, development, and divestment policy, and clearly spoke to the fact that if they were ever in a position to have to divest of parkland, those resources would go back into parks and recreation, and in particular, maintaining park and recreation infrastructure. So if you're very serious about this work, which I hope everyone on the line is today, this is where we're headed. I don't want to say like it or not, but this is where we're headed. And there is a movement around this. And we all, I think, know if we do this together and we do it in mass, we're going to have a lot of leverage. We're going to have a lot of case studies to call on and a lot of examples. And someone's always got to be first through the wall, right? They're always the bloodiest, but we'll have each other to call on as we do more of this work. Very good questions. I appreciate the commentary quite a bit. Any other thoughts, comments, questions? Actually got through that a lot faster than I thought I was going to. Anything else for the greater good?
So in the chat, everyone, while you're thinking of any last minute questions, I'm going to be adding the evaluation survey link in there, as well as the CEU. And then if you fill out the evaluation before 5 today, you'll be entered into a raffle for Wednesday. So putting that in there for you guys.
Great. All right, well, Alana, I'm going to pass it back to you. Thank you all so much. I appreciate being part of your virtual conference. I wish you all the very best. And my final comment is this one, and I've been sharing it with everyone I've been doing webinars for this year. Although I'm not a practitioner any longer, I have incredible admiration for all of you doing the tough work in the trenches right now. I was in Boulder during the last recession, and that was quite a challenge, but nothing in comparison to what we're all experiencing in this moment in time. So I have a lot of admiration for all of you. I'm very grateful for the work that you're doing for your communities. And as a colleague and part of your network, I just want to extend my appreciation and my thanks to all of you. So thank you.
Thank you so much. That was a great presentation.
Incredible.
Is that Jim Wheeler?
Hi, Jamie. How are you?
I'm good, Mr. Wheeler. How are you?
My staff was just called me. I had to come find you. They called me and said, "Oh my gosh, this is so good." Well, of course. So thanks. Thanks for helping us out here.
Absolutely. It's great to see you.
You too. We'll catch up sometime.
Sounds great. You take care.
You too.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Alana, let me know if you need any help with the recording or anything like that.
Okay,
Go ahead.
I can go ahead and stop it now,
You
or
can go ahead and stop it. Yeah.
Okay.